Hey there, everyone. I'm Scott King, and that is Sam Abadir. Hey, Sam.
Good to see you again, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing good, Really excited to talk about third-party supply chain risk with you today on the Union podcast. So you're all ready and ramped up on third parties, right? We previously talked about third-party IT risk.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work about third-party risk in the past, and IT is one of the core factors.
Yeah, that's kind of where we live, right? I'm most familiar with the third-party IT risk, but I'm going to revisit supply chain risk, right? And then my first software job was in supply chain planning, so really excited to revisit the extended supply chains and relive some theory of constraints, right? So we'll talk about some of the constraints, but just to level set everybody, let's talk a little bit about what third-party supply chain risk is, and maybe why it's, why is it important that companies measure this?
Yeah, if you go back to our last time that we visited, we talked about IT risk, right? We're really talking just about the data, things like that that's coming along, and that's important to you building stuff and adding value to your customers. This is the actual supply chain. So it's parts, materials, other things like that. And there is an IT aspect to it, but this is actually getting the actual part that you might need to build your system, to provide your service, whatever that is. And without it, you can't move forward. So third-party supply chain risk is just as critical as IT risk.
I mean, totally agree. Because you can't ship an incomplete product, right?
Like you don't have happy customers when you do.
Yeah, and there's simple examples, right? You open an IKEA box or a Lego set and you have a piece missing. Like it's not as critical as maybe not receiving or being able to buy like a vehicle, right? That's missing a computer chip.
I guess it depends on who you ask. I mean, if you buy your 6-year-old a Lego set and it's missing something and you can't fix it, that's the end of what they know, right? But put things in perspective, right? During the COVID crisis, right? All those Ford trucks were sitting out there without critical chips in them, and they couldn't ship them. And there's people who needed to still work. Ambulances get built on these trucks. Garbage trucks get built on these trucks. People, plumbers still use these trucks to haul parts around and fix things. Trucks are needed, so they couldn't ship without them. So it, just as that little Lego piece is critical to the 6-year-old and their happiness, the missing components from trucks is also very, very, very critical frankly, to a larger part of the economy.
Right. Especially here in the States where we move around a lot. But back when that was going on, we weren't moving around that much. But still, we felt the pain, right?
Oh, a lot of us weren't moving around. I actually had a guy come to my house last week. A part of my oven broke, and I asked him, "Hey, were you busy during COVID? What did you do?" Because we heard a lot of people were getting those PPP loans to provide stuff. And he goes, "I was busier than ever." He was out in a truck every single day, bringing parts, fixing things. People were at home cooking. You probably saw everybody baking bread on Facebook or something like that. But those components, those systems in the house kept breaking. And there's a lot of people that were driving around during that period of time.
The home improvement increase, because we were stuck at home. People started home improvement projects. I know Lowe's and Home Depot got really, really busy.
Yeah.
And their supply chain was affected, right? Because they had a supply, a demand increase, and be able to react to that, requires some planning, some risk mitigation. So what do companies do day to day to monitor this third-party supply chain risk? Like what do they do? Who does it? Like maybe what kind of tooling are they using besides Microsoft Excel?
That's a complicated question. And the reason it's complicated is because there's so many different facets and aspects to managing supply chain risk. And some of it is, where does your stuff come from? So, there's a lot of stuff that comes from overseas. There's a lot of things that doesn't come from overseas. Like you go back to Home Depot, lumber was in short supply, and it wasn't that the lumber was coming from overseas. It was, most of it was North American sourced, but the machinery to cut it down was coming from overseas, or parts of it were parts are coming from overseas. So we actually have that supply chain aspect, but third-party supply chain risk is even bigger, because think about the industry that you're in right now, and you probably have competitors, right? And those competitors might also buy from your same suppliers. There's a lot of companies who look at vertical integration as a strategic gain, right? As a strategic advantage, and they might buy your supplier. That is a risk to you. What if they raise your prices? What if they decide not to supply you anymore? There's all sorts of things. What if they buy it and then they put it out of business? Actually, one of my favorite beers was bought by a larger beer company and then promptly put out of business because it was causing so many problems for the company that actually acquired it. So, there's that one aspect. There's other aspects too. There's a lot of laws around there. The Department of Justice is really keen on making sure that you run your business in an up and up way. And that's a good thing for everybody. We don't like it when we hear about bribes or corruption, political influence, or anything like that, because as consumers, we know that that's not fair. And we also know that we're not going to get the best value or the newest innovations and things like that. So there's actually a lot of laws out there that prevent you from buying from what's called PEPs, or politically exposed people. There's a lot of laws out there that make sure that you're not buying things from people that are companies that are on sanctions lists from other countries, things like that. So there's a lot of things that you have to look at in your supply chain. And, you had asked Scott, who does this? And it kind of is all over the board. And sadly, in many companies, the answer is nobody's doing it. A lot of people find a lot of this stuff out in a reactionary way. In order to do this effectively, you still have to do all those IT assessments that we talked about in the last time that we chatted here on the Union. But you also have to do all of these other assessments. You have to bring in the news feeds. You have to do all of this. And a lot of people are like, oh yeah, that's easy. And then when the rubber hits the road, you find that there's an awful lot of noise in there. So it takes a lot of thought of what you want to do and how it is you want to go do it. There's a lot of challenges. It's still all very important, though.
So you said no one's doing it, but maybe they're reading the news, and I would imagine this is like giant geopolitical things, like the war in Ukraine or something like that. I don't know.
That's certainly impacted like grain supplies and things like that.
Oh,
absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What type of time frame were you thinking about? So when you said, "Hey, I'm watching the news," is this I'm looking at this daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly? Like how reactionary would you assume that companies need to monitor that effectively?
Well, I said nobody's doing it. I don't think many people are doing it well. I think some people are probably doing it well, but it really depends on what it is that you're doing. I mean, if you're a baker and you know that all of your grain is coming from a portion of Eastern Europe, or a significant portion of the world's grain is coming from Eastern Europe, and that source gets cut off, what is it that you do? I actually think there's a whole bunch of companies today that aren't looking at where lithium is supplied from. Lithium has two major sources in the world, right? There's some in China and there's some in South America. And the stuff that's in South America is at the top of a bunch of mountains, and you actually need a lot of water to mine lithium. So effectively, most of the lithium in the world is coming from China. That's a huge concentration risk of the supply of lithium. Some people are probably looking at that, but I think there's a lot of people who are not looking at that. So how often do you have to look at the news? It really depends on what the risk is that your supplier brings to you. And You have to sit there and evaluate that internally so you can figure out what is it that you have to look at and how often you have to look at that. So,
okay, that makes sense. Especially lithium, right? I think that's probably a good example. Everybody listening to this podcast, I would probably 100% has lithium, right? Because you're listening to it on your laptop or your iPhone,
right? Or if you drive an EV, that's a lithium battery inside your car.
Yeah, I mean it's everywhere. So how are they going to mitigate that risk, right? So the grain example, like I get, right? If I'm a baker, I would imagine there's not a lot of bakers listening to the Union podcast since we talk about AI all the time.
Just too bad.
But I mean, maybe they, who knows, right?
Going to mitigation though, it's no matter who you are or how frequently you've decided that you have to, watch and manage and track the news or run assessments or anything like that. It comes down to a couple of core steps, right? Figure out what's your process, automate your process as much as possible. And when you can automate it, you have to make sure that you're in danger of not giving yourself a tidal wave of noise, right? So
what do you mean by that? Tidal, like give yourself a tidal wave of noise. So this sounds like a self-imposed problem. So what are you talking about?
I once worked with a third-party threat assessment company, right? And they gave me threat assessments of my entire IT landscape. And I just kept getting one by one email alerts of here's a threat, here's a threat, here's a threat, here's a threat. And and every time I read one, I'd be like, oh, that's not really important to me. That's not important to me. That's not important to me. And 94 out of 100 of them were not important to me, but I had to go through all of them. It was just a lot of noise that was sent my way. I needed something smarter. I needed something, frankly, I needed AI. I needed AI to go through and read all these things and identify which threats actually matched up to my environment and to the technology I had in my environment. And that would have cut out at least 80% of the things. And then if it was a little bit smarter and can understand where the technology lived in my environment, that would have just only brought the 6 important things to me daily, and I could focus on that. Does that make sense?
I mean, that makes sense, especially in IT threat landscape.
Right. Same type of thing with supply chain, right?
Yeah.
If I'm just bringing in news of my major supplier, I'm going to see every stock update. I'm going to see every PR announcement that they put out. I'm going to see everything versus geopolitical news related specifically to them or sanction news specifically to them. And there are a couple services that can focus down on one thing, but I really should take a broader look at that and be able to funnel in sources of information everywhere that can look for the things that are really just important to what I need. So I know how to make a plan, I know how to react, or I know how to be proactive with my next steps.
And it seems like that would only become more prevalent, right? Because people don't retire systems or feeds that you were talking about, threat feeds. They keep adding systems. So it's becoming more and more complex. And I've got less and less people to do it. And then throw in the third-party suppliers. They have the same issue too, right? I mean, their supply chain is changing, and their customer base is changing, and mergers and acquisitions.
Nth party is, you've just complicated things so much more. But think about the news, right? I mean, when you see the news and something happens, something bad happens, and then you have all these armchair quarterbacks that have 20/20 hindsight. They're like, you should have known, right? Or say armchair quarterbacks, really they're more armchair regulators and armchair lawyers. You should have known. The data was there. there's a lot of data out there and there's a lot of information out there. And sometimes it's just really difficult, especially in a cost-effective manner, to find out what's important.
So that is interesting. In a cost-effective manner, is this a high cost for organizations to monitor and manage this supply chain risk?
Manually, you'll get overwhelmed, and every time you add a person, you're going to increase the opportunity for error. So it can be, the cost around third-party risk management can easily explode. I remember when I first heard about third-party risk management, I'm like, oh, this is simple. Send out a spreadsheet and ask the information and get it back. Well, what happens when you have 100 suppliers? Now what happens when your chief risk officer or your board of director, or you're making that quarterly report for those guys, wants to know it by spend or by tier or by risk level. And as soon as you spend hours or days or literally weeks putting that information together across the 150 vendors that you've chosen, not the 150 vendors that you have, because you might actually have 500 or 600 or 700 vendors, but the 150 vendors you've chosen, you've massaged all of those spreadsheets every single time, creating an opportunity to put error in there. Now they ask for it trended over a 3-year period, or they ask for a different slice, and you've basically got to start over. It becomes very, very, very complex. So, doing things manually leaves room for error and it can explode your cost. So having automated, simple, data-driven ways to bring this information in a meaningful way to your risk program is super, super important. Adding AI to it is frankly super important too, if you can get over that hurdle of developing a model and then implementing the model, right? Because the development of the model can become very costly, and then it just 9 out of 10 times it becomes shelfware because nobody knows how to implement the model after you've actually put it in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And it really makes sense from our perspective, right? Orchestrate a process, add AI, get good, clean data. I think that is it's a good way to simplify the process, and it's a good way for us to wrap up on third-party supply chain risk, right?
It really is, right? I mean, if you can have all the tools only present you with the things that it knows is important and all the things that it thinks it could be important, now you get to spend your time managing risk versus shoveling through data, right? You've made your job a happier job, and you've made it a more productive job. You've brought value to your organization.
All right. Well, perfect, Sam. Well, thanks so much for your time on third-party supply chain risk. If anybody is interested in taking a look how we could help you actually orchestrate the process, we know a thing or two about that. But I appreciate it, Sam.
I kind of geek out on this, so let me know. I'm happy to talk.
All right. Thanks so much. See you next time.
Hey, we'll see you soon.